Hello, everyone. Welcome, Emily. It's great to have you here. As usual, I will invite you to start us off by telling us who you are.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Ben. I appreciate the opportunity to come on and introduce myself to everyone. Hi, my name is Emily Collins. I recently completed my master's degree at Lakehead University in Social Justice Studies. Professor Ben here was one of my advisors. I work at Ronald McDonald House Charities currently, doing health equity work as a family service coordinator. And I'm an overall advocate, social justice researcher, student, and citizen of Canada. So that's kind of me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. Would you describe yourself then as a social justice advocate, a student, and what was the last thing you said? Something about Canada.
Yes. And I'm from Canada. I would definitely describe myself as a researcher and advocate, someone who's always learning, teaching and growing and trying to learn as many new things as possible about the ever-growing field of social justice. And I am Canadian. That is something that I feel is important to provide listeners, as that is part of my identity. And I am of settler colonial descent living in Turtle Island. So that is something that I like to recognize whenever I'm doing my studying and my advocacy as part of my own positionality.
Okay, I mean, you touched on something that is also very much close to my own research interests. And maybe or for people who aren't familiar with the Canadian context, uh, what does it mean? You said you are from a settler Canadian origin. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so my family came to Canada from both Ireland and England way long before I was here and settled in New Brunswick and then came to Ontario as well. So we're kind of spread out all over the provinces in Canada. And we were, as many other people of settler colonial descent, are a part of that original group of Europeans who came to Canada and colonized Indigenous land. So that is kind of where my story started in Canada, where my family's story started. And that is how we ended up here today versus being in Europe.
Mm. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of newcomers to Canada, and a lot of them weren't aware of this dynamics of Canada until they actually came to the country. You know, that Canada is a settler colonial country, and that there are still so many of the issues that newcomers also experience from whence they came from. So could you maybe speak to that a little bit? What is the current state of the relationship between the settlers, newcomers, and maybe even indigenous people? If you could speak to that a little bit. We know that Canada has had a checkered history in terms of its treatment of indigenous people, and in 2008 initiated the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, something that a lot of societies recovering from conflict have also established, like South Africa and Rwanda, and that ended in 2015. Could you just speak briefly about that, the progress that has been made since 2015, and where you see Canada headed, in what direction?
That's a big one.
Yeah.
That's a very big question. And that's something that as a student, I'm 25, so I'm just finishing my educational journey now with my master's that I've been researching and talking about with teachers, professors, fellow students of, what does this mean and what is the general context of how we got to where we are today. And as you mentioned, Ben, I think that we still have a very inconsistent kind of checkered environment right now where we do talk about things that are changing in our country. However, there are still so many similarities back to where we first started.
Mm.
And I think that there is a good faith effort being put in by Canadians to learn more. However, we have a very, very long way to go. And you mentioned newcomers as well, folks who are coming from Africa, who are coming from Europe, who are coming from the Middle East, who aren't really aware of things like this. And I think that's because Canada still very much has a moral blind spot when it comes to the Indigenous relationship with our country. I think that it has been so far removed from our forefront, from our current perspective, that it's just getting lost and it keeps getting pushed back. And no matter how loud you are, no matter how you continue to advocate in any advocacy journey as a Canadian for our Indigenous families and our, brothers and sisters and our friends in the community, it's always paused and it always gets lost. And I think that's just because, again, that moral blind spot of it makes us uncomfortable. So we don't really want to look at it. So it kind of just goes in the rear view back to, oh, that was 60 years ago, or oh, that was 20 years ago. But really, like, the last residential school in Canada closed, and I might not have the date right, but I think it was the 60s or 70s, which, realistically, that's not that long ago. And even though it feels very far removed from our current day, it's not. And that advocacy journey is still very much alive and new and something that people are sometimes uncomfortable with. And then that's just, leads an opportunity for more advocacy and more learning. And I think that's where Canada is attempting to head. Again, that good faith effort in their advocacy, but there is a lot of work to do.
Yeah, thank you so much for shedding light on that. And you mentioned that it's something that a lot of people aren't comfortable with. But you are in a discipline that is not necessarily a comfortable one. How did you get there or here?
Well, I was a bit of a troublemaker growing up, and there were a lot of things that made me uncomfortable. And if you ask my mother, she will say I was never able to really keep my mouth shut about the things that I didn't like. And when I was in high school, in I think it was a geography class, I remember our teacher, his name was Mr. Ollie. I remember him so clearly, him kind of driving the importance to us about how important it is to learn about uncomfortable situations from a young age. And in that class, we talked about not just, the geography of Canada, the stories of Canada, but we also talked about international relations. That was kind of where my first introduction to that was. And I remember learning about the Rwandan genocide when I was 14 or 15. And that was when I kind of realized, like, the world is not as sunshine and rosy as the Ontario education system, or just the Canadian education system in general kind of makes it out to be when it comes to international relations. And from there, I, did some homework, did some research, which has led me to now where I am when it comes to my own studies with Canada in Africa. And I was very loud about it, as I always am, with my teachers and my friends and folks in school. And that's kind of where it started for me, and it has not ended, and I don't think it ever will.
Wonderful. That loudness I can actually attest to. Um,
Yes, you can.
all right. So you mentioned Rwanda there, and maybe we can just get straight into what you did in terms of your research for your master's degree in social justice. What was it about?
Yeah, so my master's degree was feels like a long time coming. It's really not, considering I am quite young, although I feel very old. I tried to get into post-secondary education for a master's degree, I think twice before I actually got in. So I kind of went into it feeling a little bit discouraged, but equally as excited. And when I got to Lakehead, I knew exactly what I wanted to study. And I wanted to study Canada in Africa, because that's something that I've been looking at since I was, 15 years old. And it was where I was most excited as a researcher and as a student. So the inspiration kind of came from where I liked to look at the United Nations, the political environment in the 1990s in Canada, and kind of, move my way through different countries, different spheres, and learn as much as I could about what really happened in that time period, especially as, someone who has studied political science as well. So my inspiration kind of came from conversations that I had with my grandfather when I was younger. So he was a peacekeeper, a United Nations peacekeeper, and I get my loudness from him. He is a very loud advocate as well, and it's a very beautiful thing to watch. And we would always talk about, again, the things that make you uncomfortable. And something that as a peacekeeper that he had to grapple with was, sometimes the military is not what it's made out to be. And it's got some secrets and it's got some areas where they could improve. And that led me to looking at the Somalia Affair in the 1990s and Canada's involvement in the killing of three Somali citizens.
Mm,
And that's where I wrote my thesis, as you know. You're
mm.
my advisor.
Okay, I mean, you mentioned your grandfather there because another question I was thinking of asking you as you were talking was, why Somalia, right? But you mentioned that your grandfather, was a peacekeeper, and probably the relationship you have with him kind of inspired you to also explore Canada's role elsewhere. Because I mean, you talked about the so many discomforts that Canadians live with. And regardless, you were able to look beyond Canada. So I wanted to ask, like, why outside? Whereas you could have, settled and focused within. I mean, not to say that every researcher has to begin from home. So you have given us a very good context of, some of the issues that Canada faces. But you were still able to step out of that and go to Somalia. Um, what
Yes.
what what were some of your findings then in terms of how Canada has reshaped its peacekeeping mission since, Somalia?
That's a really good question, also a very big question. My findings were, kind of again looking at time periods as well, is the 1990s realistically, although it feels a very long time ago, was really not that long ago. And what happened in Somalia was such a large atrocity and failure of the Canadian politicians, of the Canadian military. And it's still one of those things that, in my opinion, as from what my findings were, that there's still that moral blind spot. We don't teach the Somalia Affair in Canadian high schools. We don't teach much of that when it comes to first year, second year undergraduate classes, when it comes to international relations crisis. And for me, it was very important to look at that because that moral blind spot just keeps appearing, kind of like what I mentioned earlier. Canada very much has a moral blind spot when it comes to things going on within the entire continent of Africa, which I have a very large problem with, that moral blind spot. And my findings were that Canada still has a lot of work to do now in 2024 on, anti-racist theory within the military, within education in the military. What are we teaching Canadians about international relations with Africa? So growing up, I found that a common discourse in the classroom was that we would look at African countries as third world, as developed, as poor. And that was never something that I really wanted to believe. And then going through all of this and all of the research there and realizing that that discourse was created by settler colonials for
Mm,
whatever reason, that's a whole other discussion. And there's a lot of work to do when it comes to kind of changing that discourse in a North American context.
right. And you just got back from Ghana.
I did.
Not just, but was that in December or yeah?
I was in Ghana from October till November.
Wow, how was
So,
that?
oh, hot. Ghana was very hot, especially growing up in Canada. I was not expecting it, but Ghana was incredible. It was a life-changing experience, and I feel so connected to the community and the culture and the country, and I cannot wait to go back. I'm so excited.
Did you feel so connected the first few days you were there, or did it take you time?
It took me time for sure. I think that, discourse again, growing up in Canada, growing up in a settler colonial country of that third world developing country. And, even though I didn't want to believe that about Ghana as I was going, I think there was definitely a small part of me that still held that prejudice against, an African country. And I got to Ghana and I saw things that look very different from what Toronto looks like. And I was immediately overwhelmed thinking, like, what did I get myself into? I am unprepared. I am like, I should not be here. I am invading their personal space, and that's not fair. And then after my, time came to an end and I learned as much as I could about Ghana, I realized how wrong I was, and again, how wrong our, education system is here about African countries,
Mm.
and just left feeling so full and light. And yeah, it was just the best time.
Okay, what were some of the surprises?
The surprises, how kind people were.
Okay.
It's very different. Like Canadians have a reputation of being the nicest people in the world. And what I would say to all Canadians is you should go to Ghana if you want to experience the nicest people in the world. I felt very welcomed from the minute I stepped out of the airport. There was people greeting me, saying hello, asking me how I am, and it was very much the same when walking through the communities, going to the schools, people saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and really taking a genuine interest in what I was doing in Ghana, as I was visually someone who was different, someone who they're not necessarily used to seeing, and welcoming me and appreciating me. So I was able to then, welcome and appreciate them as well and create a really beautiful relationship. So although I was expecting to meet incredible people while I was there, I was not expecting just how welcoming that they were going to be. And it was such a beautiful experience, that human connection that we all crave and look for. And
Mm.
I definitely found what I was looking for in Ghana regarding friendships, mentorships, role models, like things like that.
What were some of the shocks?
The shocks, the heat.
Okay.
You and I talked about that many, many times. The heat was not my favorite. I learned very quickly that I am not made for that. I loved Africa, but I don't know if Africa really loves me all that much, or Ghana, I should say, when it came to, the physical health kind of that part. But something that shocked me is going back to that discourse from growing up in Canada of, me expecting for there to be just, chaos, very sincere feelings of distress, and then going to Ghana and being in a community that was very, very small, very different from what I was used to. It looked how I was expecting for it to look from movies, from books, from photographs, except even though those pictures matched what I've seen here, the environment did not match what those descriptions were. It was happy and beautiful and bright. And again, the people were just so kind. And I learned very quickly that the lifestyle that we have here in Canada, that we see as that North American dream, that like hardly attainable lifestyle when it comes to happiness, mental health, emotion, things like that. In Ghana, it's there and it's present. And even though, houses might look different or transportation might look different, the tuk-tuks and taxis, those were very different for me than what I've seen here, like in Toronto and in Ontario. And it looks very, very different,
Mm.
but it was better.
Mm. 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 So what you're saying is that each society probably has got its own indicators of happiness, of
Yes,
maybe peace, and so on. And
absolutely.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
is
And
sorry, go ahead.
no, I was going to say something I remember you and I talked about before I left is, maybe what I wouldn't see walking down the streets of Toronto or in Ontario or like somewhere in Canada is, maybe seeing someone who's barefoot. For me, I might think that looks very uncomfortable. But for that person in, a different country, in a different environment who is walking barefoot is thinking like, wow, this feels great today. I'm just so happy to, be up and be moving around and feel the sand on my feet. The kind of same with the idea of like a tattered t-shirt, for example. I saw much of that while I was gone. And that perspective over there was very much, I've got a great shirt today. Look at me go. Like I'm clothed, I'm happy, and I am taken care of. And that was very, very different to experience compared to what we see over here, which is that, capitalist, consumerist environment.
Mm. Or it could also mean that, hey, look at me, I don't have shoes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So
I
sometimes
don't
it's
want
deep,
to
so
paint it
sometimes it's
as
not.
all positive that, oh, people are so at one with nature that they could just walk out.
Oh, yeah. No, for sure. No, there's, it depends on the person and their own positionality, but it's, yeah,
I
different.
don't have shoes, but it's not going to stop me from anything, right?
Right? Yeah, there you go. Yeah,
Yeah.
that, determined attitude. I liked it.
What were you doing there?
I was working with an NGO doing an internship on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I actually kind of pivoted while I was there and focused mainly on the education program. And while I was there, I did one-on-ones with students in the community, as well as led some lessons and supported some group lessons with Girl Guides, and really got to dive in deep to the educational aspect and see what the schools were like and meet the teachers. And
Mm,
it was great.
How were the schools like compared to what you were used to here?
Oh, very different. Very, very different. The first thing I noticed with most of the schools is the color.
Mm,
Is, so many things were hand painted and there was art, and that was very much a part of the like curriculum and very much a part of the joy of being in that kind of environment. And I really, really liked that. That's not something that you see in Ontario. The schools were definitely, physically not necessarily what I was expecting. Maybe some, cracked tile here and there. There was like, 40 students in one very, very small classroom. And I'm used to air conditioning and fans and closed doors, but there's no door, there's no fan, there's definitely no air conditioning in a very, very small village. And it was again still that just attitude of being happy to be at school no matter what it looks like physically. And that was something that you don't really see in Ontario. I feel like there's, not a very good discourse surrounding education, especially in our political environment right now. So to be around that and just experience something new was very special.
mm. So what would you say to probably, other people like you who are excited about going elsewhere, maybe to an African country, to also volunteer, their talents and gifts, either teaching or helping communities. What would you say to such, people embarking on a journey like the one you did?
Good question. If, I'm thinking about myself when I first considered doing international travel or traveling to Africa, and I really wish that I had someone tell me that, you're not necessarily there to help, to save, to, work so hard to create change. While you're there, it's a partnership. You're going to maybe introduce a new skill set to already, to what's the word? It's just to join what's already happening. You're a partner. You're advocating alongside that community, not for that community.
Mm,
There's already amazing work going on, and it's very special that you're able to go. It's a privilege you're able to go and to experience that. But whether you're there does not make or break the progress. And I think that's a hard lesson to learn, as that settler colonial young woman who's excited to travel and to experience new cultures and new countries, but it's one that's very important as an ethical consideration before you start your journey, whether it be volunteering, traveling, or working.
wonderful. So you're done with your master's, you're back from Ghana. What is next for Emily?
Good question. What's next for me would be, maybe looking at full-time work in the international development sector, maybe the government relations sector. My second post-grad was in government relations studies, so I'm very interested in doing that. Ultimately, I would love to stay with international relations and government. That's kind of where my heart lies. And then we'll just kind of see from there. I'm open to new opportunities, new cities, new places. So we'll just kind of have to trust the universe and see.
And indeed, I experienced such openness working with you on your research, ever so willing, to learn, to make those corrections, but also I learn a lot, listening to you, the stories of your grandfather, but just really your interest in what Canada is doing outside of its own borders. And so you are quite exemplary in what you do and also stepping out
Thank you.
to go see things for yourself, a very pleasant attitude. And that willingness and openness, I'm sure, will take you places. So we wish you the best in all your endeavors. And thank you again for taking the time to come speak, to me today. We hope to have you again just to catch up with
Of
what
course.
You're
Anything for you, Ben. So happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.